Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Gene Positive Podcast. I'm your host, Diane Campbell, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about different types of grief and how they manifest in Huntington's disease. I really wanted to do an episode talking about grief because it's something that for a really long time I only had a superficial understanding of. So, the way that I'm going to break this down is by the type of grief, the definition, and a little example or scenario of how that type of grief comes up in Huntington's disease. Before I get started, I wanted to say that I'm going to go through quite a few examples of grief and how it can look, but I just want to acknowledge that there might be experiences that exist outside of what I'm going to share. So, the first one we're going to talk about is normal or uncomplicated grief. And this is the type of grief I would say that I was familiar with for the majority of my life. And so it's kind of defined as a natural response to a significant loss that changes over time. Emotions come in waves and gradually become more manageable, even though the person is still missed. And so, an example or a scenario of this is when maybe someone loses their parent to Huntington's disease after years of progression. So, they might feel sadness, anger, relief, love, lots of different kinds of emotions. But over time, they'll start to function again while still grieving their parent. The next one I'm going to talk about is anticipatory grief. And this is one that came up for me personally in a lot of my therapy and counseling sessions. And one that for me was the aha moment when I kind of understood the term and the definition and how it related to me personally. So, anticipatory grief is grief that begins before a loss happens, often when someone expects decline, death, or major change in their future. So, when it comes to Huntington's disease, this can exist in a variety of ways, but one of them is maybe when a gene positive person grieves the future before symptoms start. So, they're fearing loss of independence, their career, their identity, and what Huntington's disease may mean for their family. So, I can definitely say this is one that I personally align with. When I tested gene positive, these are a lot of the feelings that I felt and still continue to feel when it comes to grieving the future. For me, one of the biggest things was understanding these emotions and feelings and thoughts as a form of grief, being able to label it for what it is and understand it for what it is helps me to recognize it when it comes up and be able to say, okay, this is my grief, and do my best to make time and space for that grief, to feel it, to work through it, all of those things. The next type of grief we're going to talk about is complicated or prolonged grief. And this grief is one that remains intense and disabling for a really long time. And it interferes with daily functioning, and acceptance feels impossible. So, an example of this is maybe somebody's partner passes away from Huntington's, and that person remains stuck in overwhelming grief for months or years later, and they're unable to return to daily life activities. They have constant longing, and they're unable to accept the loss. And so this is similar to the first one we talked about that was the normal grief. But instead of it being something that you can return to your functioning again, it's something where you're stuck in that overwhelmed state. I think this comes up in a lot of families that experience Huntington's disease, whether they are the ones that have the disease or whether they are caregivers or supporters within the family. This is something that nobody can control or anticipate. It's so unique and individual, and it's a really complex thing to try and overcome and work through. The next type of grief that we're going to talk about is called disenfranchised grief. And this is another type of grief that really resonated with me personally in my experience with Huntington's. So, this is a type of grief that isn't typically socially recognized, validated, or supported. So somebody may feel like they have to grieve privately when they're feeling this type of grief. And a good example of this when it comes to Huntington's is maybe a gene positive person is grieving their future and their identity, but others are saying, "Oh, you're fine right now. You don't have symptoms right now. You're healthy right now." And that person feels isolated and ashamed for grieving something that others can't see or understand. I would say that I definitely had a few people in my life that said these types of things or gave similar vibes in a conversation when I tested gene positive. And It definitely made me feel like everything that I was going through and all my thoughts and feelings and emotions were not seen and not understood because for me, everything changed. I needed to learn how to make space for this and move through this, and had no idea how I was going to do any of that. It felt like my entire identity was flipped upside down, and everything that I knew about myself and all that I thought my future was gonna be completely changed. Although I was no different physically from one moment to the next, emotionally and mentally, it felt like everything changed for me. So I definitely felt alone with that in the beginning. I would also say, though, that I have the viewpoint and perspective and understanding that the people in my life only meant the best by what they were trying to say and do. And they were only trying to make me feel better in a situation that felt helpless. I also understood their intentions. Having said that, with this type of grief or with any type of grief, to be honest, both things can be true. You can exist in the grief and people can be loving you and supporting you in ways that might not feel the greatest in the moment. And I think it's important to recognize both perspectives and both realities. I also think it's important not to jump to conclusions that people don't understand or that people are ill-intentioned or passive of what you're going through. Another way that I try to support this grief for myself is to have open conversations and honest conversations about how I'm feeling and what I'm needing in those moments. Sometimes I think people are doing their best and trying their best from their perspective and what they know, but sometimes the easiest thing is to just share, this is what I need, this is how I feel, this would be the most helpful. And this is why XYZ is not that helpful for me right now. And usually I find that helps to bring the wall down between the two existences and allow for people to support and love the way that they're trying to. The next type of grief that we're going to talk about is called collective grief. And this is a type of grief that's experienced by a group, family, or community after a major loss or tragedy. And so in regards to Huntington's, this could look like a family that has lost multiple relatives across generations to Huntington's disease. At one funeral, everyone is grieving not only the person who passed away, but the whole legacy of loss and fear. This is definitely one that comes up a lot for families with HD. HD is a generational disease, and whether you are the person that is positive or if you are negative, it impacts everybody significantly and uniquely. And as a community, we share these experiences. So when there is a loss or a tragedy, we have this collective understanding of what everybody is going through and feeling. And it's important to recognize that as a type of grief as well. The next one I'm going to talk about is ambiguous grief or ambiguous loss. And this is another one that resonates personally for me. This type of grief is caused by loss without closure. So when someone is physically present but psychologically changed or missing without certainty. And an example of this regarding Huntington's disease is a mother is still alive, but Huntington's disease has changed her personality and memory. The child feels like they've already lost her, but there's no clear ending or closure in sight. And so this one is one that I definitely resonate with as a daughter of a mother that has Huntington's disease and has watched her change and decline over the last 20 years. And I think this is a really complex situation for a child or a young person to be moving throughout their entire life and watching somebody that they love and care for slowly disappear and having this ambiguous grief taking place and maybe not recognizing that it's taking place. I can say this happened to me personally. As a child growing up, I never understood my feelings as grief. And it took until the recent years of my life to actually label all of what I experienced as complex, ambiguous grief. And once I started being able to label this as a type of grief that I was experiencing and understanding where it was rooted, and knowing that when I had things coming up that I've been working through or feeling, that it's important to allow space and time for those things to exist and to be felt and to be heard. Ambiguous grief is something that continues to exist in my life and that I feel every day as my mother continues to decline and as I see her changing more significantly. And I think it'll continue to be complex even after she passes away because of the way that I've been grieving her my entire life. The next type of grief we're going to be talking about is called absent grief. So this is when someone doesn't feel expected grief emotions after a loss, often due to numbness, shock, survival mode, or delayed processing. And so, an example of this in regards to Huntington's is after a parent dies from Huntington's, someone feels numb instead of sad. They worry something is wrong with them, but later the grief shows up as anxiety, exhaustion, or delayed sadness. I think it's important to understand that when we experience something so significant in our lives, sometimes what happens is our bodies are protecting ourselves. And so sometimes we respond with being numb instead of the expected feelings and emotions that should come with the devastating event that took place. And I think we're our worst enemies when it comes to judging ourselves throughout that process. On top of what we're already going through and feeling, we're judging ourselves of how we should be feeling. And ultimately, that logical thinking and judgment that we have on top of what is already a hard experience doesn't help. So I haven't experienced this in the example I shared with having a parent pass away yet, but I have experienced this when I tested gene positive. And for me, I felt similar things to being numb and in shock and feeling stuck. And it took me a really long time to come out of those. And I definitely saw this type of grief come up as anxiety, exhaustion, and overfunctioning before anything else. So I think whether it's Huntington's related or just anything in anybody's life where they experience this kind of reaction to a traumatic experience or significant change in their lives, it's normal for your body to try and protect you. And the biggest thing is to allow yourself to go through what you need to go through and be patient with it while it's happening and not be judging yourself on top of everything that's already going on. The next type of grief we're going to be talking about is called secondary grief. And this is a grief that comes from the ripple effects of the main loss and the additional losses that follow. And so, an example that relates to Huntington's disease is maybe after diagnosis or progression, a person grieves not only Huntington's, but also their job, friendships, independence, confidence, finances, and life plans. I think this is likely a common grief that comes up for many people in the HD community. Your autonomy and the things you love and what you dream about and the way you live your life. All of these things might slowly change over time or be taken away completely. I would say for people that don't fully understand Huntington's disease and the complexities that comes with it, I think it's really important to acknowledge that yes, the disease is a big part of somebody's life, but it's not everything. And more so, it's the changes that are happening into these other aspects of somebody's life that are impactful. And that's not the same for everybody. It fluctuates and it's unique. But I think it's important to acknowledge how the disease impacts somebody as a whole and not just as the symptoms of the disease. The next type of grief we're going to be talking about is called cumulative grief or compounded grief. And this is when multiple losses happen close together and the person doesn't have time to process each one. And so, an example of this in regards to Huntington's might be in 1 year, someone becomes a caregiver, loses their job from burnout, their relationship ends due to stress, and their loved one passes away. And this just leaves them in a completely emotionally overwhelmed. I think that this grief is also really common when it comes to Huntington's disease. A lot of times, we are just doing our best to push through from one day to the next and trying to keep on top of everything and bounce back from everything as fast as we can and be there for everyone as much as we can and take care of ourselves as much as we can. And that can be really exhausting. And especially when there's things happening like loss or burnout. When it comes to the Huntington's community, I think that it's natural for all of us to want to support and care for and provide and to do absolutely everything we can for the people that we love that are experiencing varied realities of this disease. But it's so important that we are taking care of ourselves first. And the cliche saying of making sure your cup is filled before you can fill anybody else's is just so true. Because when you try to fill from an empty cup or a cup that you're not refilling regularly, that's when things get messy. And that's where things start to feel out of control and out of our grasp. And that's a really dangerous line that we don't want to cross. So it's really important that you're taking care of yourself, you're making the boundaries you need to, and that you continuously reflect on what that looks like and what your needs are, because it's likely that they're going to be changing over time or with different situations that you're in. However, I want to acknowledge that there's situations that happen that are completely out of our control. And no matter what we do, it just seems like it's one thing after the next. And I would say in those situations, give yourself permission to sit in the discomfort of it all. And that might be really hard to do but it's really important that you do your best to slow down in those situations as best as you can. And knowing that there's a lot of resources out there and people to talk to that can help you work through all of those things that are taking place, even when it feels like you are the only person that is going through that and experiencing that. I promise there's people that can understand you and help you. The last type of grief we're going to talk about is called traumatic grief. And this is a grief that happens following a sudden, shocking, or deeply distressing loss. It can include trauma symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, or panic. And so, an example of this in regards to HD might look like when somebody witnesses the late stages of Huntington's disease emergencies. And it might be choking, severe falls, intense aggression. And after death, as much as they are grieving, they are also reliving traumatic moments or feeling unsafe in their body. So, this is definitely a very real and serious type of grief that someone might experience with Huntington's disease. And I also think it's the silent truth of a lot of people that don't always share the more severe parts of the disease or traumatic experiences that they've had with family members. I can say that I've definitely experienced this type of grief in regards to having Huntington's in my family. I won't go into the specific details of it, but I do want to acknowledge that this is very real. And it's really important that people that are struggling to work through this, reach out and find professional support that can help them work through this. And not everybody has access to that, but if there's any ways that you can find safe places to land with some of these more serious complexities of the disease, that would be the most beneficial space for you to be in. And so maybe that looks like support groups or online forums or somewhere where you can share your story without having to expose yourself or feel uncomfortable. And if you are someone listening to this right now and you are thinking that that kind of environment and safe space would be supportive for you, but you don't know where to start, please feel free to reach out and message me. And I'm happy to try and help you and support you and get you connected. Because I think it's really important to have that support with something this traumatic and this complex. So, if you've made it this far in the episode, I want to say thank you because I know it's not easy to listen to all of those different types of grief and the definitions and how they manifest in Huntington's disease. And I know that it is something that likely brought up some feelings or emotions or thoughts or past experiences. I just want to say thank you for listening and for holding space for all of those things throughout this episode. Again, just to reiterate, I'm not a healthcare professional. I'm not somebody that's trained or experienced in regards to complex and traumatic grief. But for me, learning about different types of grief and being able to label them for what they are and understand them for how they exist in my life was something that was really impactful for me in the last couple years of my life when I've attended therapy and counseling and support groups. So I wanted to share a little bit about this with you and to make you feel seen and heard with some of this and hopefully inspire you to reflect on yourself and think about how different types of grief might exist in your journey. That's all for this episode of the Gene Positive podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for taking the time to be gene positive with me.